If you made a joke about Hitler, well, I don't know what would happen to a 12-year-old making a joke, but if you were an adult and made a joke about Hitler, then you could end up in a concentration camp. Germany attacked Denmark. That was on the April 9th, 1940, and I was at that time 11 years old. I woke up one morning at a tremendous noise. I looked out the window, and there were dozens of airplanes flying low over the houses. And I could see they were German airplane bombers, and mainly. That eventually, of course, affected our lives. The first couple of years, it wasn't too bad. So then a resistance movement came about. And of course, the Germans didn't like that. They started retaliating. They would take hostages and shoot them. They would just go out in the streets and lie and grab 10 or 15 people and put them in prison. And then they would take a couple of them out and shoot them whenever something happened. Of course, when you're 11 years old and you sit by the highway and you see the Germans come in on their motorcycles and their tanks and whatnot, that is, I must admit, that was exciting. But the excitement soon went away because it affected life. For instance, you couldn't talk openly as you were used to do. You had to be careful about what you said. So by 1943, the resistance was very active, to the point where the Germans in July, August, they instituted a curfew. Everybody had to be in their home at 8 o'clock. If you were out in the streets, they would shoot. And of course, in Denmark, it doesn't get dark. In July, August, it doesn't get dark until midnight. And many people were dependent upon small gardens. They had to grow vegetables. And they had to do that after work. They would get off at work at 4 or 5 or 6 in the evening. And then if they had to be inside by 8 o'clock, there was no time to work in their little gardens. So that went on for a couple of weeks, and then one day, the workers in the biggest shipyard in Copenhagen, they simply put down the tools and went home in the middle of the day. They went on strike. And that spread. So in about one day, the whole country was on strike. Nothing was done. The trains didn't run, the factories didn't do anything, and then the Germans, they sealed off Copenhagen. I happened to be outside Copenhagen that day. I went to a beach, and when I wanted to go back into town, there we couldn't get back in. There were soldiers standing at all the roads going into town, and so I had some relatives outside Copenhagen, so there was not a big problem. But eventually, after 3 or 4 days, the Germans realized that they had to do something because everything came to a standstill, and they were dependent upon things that were made in the factories. So they gave in, and they did away with the curfew so people could work in their gardens. So that in a way was a victory. Then in 1944, things got pretty bad. A lot of shooting, a lot of killing, a lot of executions. And by that time I was 15 years old. And some of us were recruited by the resistance. They didn't use 15-year-old boys to go out and blow up railroads, but we were taking food to Jews that were in hiding, because late 1943, the Germans, they went after the Danish Jews, but somebody in the German occupation government told somebody in the Danish, well, not exactly government, because the government had been cancelled, but they told somebody, or this man told somebody, that the Jews would be arrested on a certain day. So the head rabbi in Copenhagen, he called a meeting, and he told the Jews that came to the meeting that on such and such a day they better not be in their apartments, they should be somewhere else. As he said, go to your Christian friends and hide there. And many Jews, of course, didn't believe it. They couldn't believe that something like that would happen. It so happened that, well, there were at that time maybe 5,000 Jews in Denmark, and they were like anybody else because they came about 200 years ago from Poland around 1750 or 1760. So they were, for all practical purposes, they were just like anybody else in the country. So about 4,500 they got to Sweden. Fishermen took them across. It takes about, well, it's about 20 kilometers between Sweden and Denmark. And Sweden was neutral. There weren't any Germans there. So, but the problem was, of course, it had to be paid for. You can't expect a fisherman to risk his own life and risk his boat, his livelihood, without getting some compensation. And I think the going price was something like 800 crowns per person. In today's money, that would probably have been about $200 or $300. Of course, many of the Jews, they were like ordinary people. If there were 4 in the family, all of a sudden to come up with 2,000. Well, what else happened in 44? We were getting pretty tired of the whole thing. Of course, food was rationed because the Germans stole a lot of food, so there was less for us. And but there were some countries that fared a lot worse. For instance, Holland and Norway were much worse off than we were because our agriculture could feed a population that were at least 3 times as big as the Danish population. So the rationing was not too bad, and we could always buy fish. I mean, Denmark consists of a number of islands, there's water all around. But there were many things, for instance, such a thing as we take for granted, like salt. You couldn't buy salt because it's too cold. You cannot get salt out of the seawater. You cannot evaporate it because it's too cold. And the closest salt mines were in Germany, in southern Germany. And they needed all the salt they could get for making weapons or ammunition or whatever they used salt for. But it was something necessary for them. And of course, pepper didn't exist because where does pepper come from? You don't grow pepper in Denmark. So there was no coffee, no tea. They made a tea out of apples. They would shred apples and dry them. And then you could make a tea of that, Then, of course, we began to get impatient at the end of 44 because we could see that the war would end pretty soon. The Germans were retreated on all fronts. And then, in 45, the Germans got more and more aggressive, shot more and more people. And but then finally, on May 4th, there was a broadcast on the British radio saying that the Germans had capitulated. So that was the end of that. Well, almost the end. We still had about 200,000 German refugees as the Russians came into Germany from the east. The German population fled, and many of them were taken by the German military up to Denmark, for instance. My school was taken and used for refugees. So we had them for, Germany couldn't take them back because they needed everything. The cities were bombed out and they didn't have enough food. So I think we had those 200,000 German refugees for 3 or 4 years.
Wow.
They were in camps. They couldn't get out of the camps, but they were fed. They had medical services and so forth. It wasn't really like a German concentration camp because they lived well, but you don't live well if you cannot go where you want to go. And of course, we couldn't have 200,000 foreigners running around the country. The country is very, very small, 16,000 square miles. And the population, the Danish population was about 5 million. So 200,000 foreigners, that's a big, big portion.
Yeah.
So eventually they went home, but our economy was completely destroyed. Even as late as 1955, when I immigrated to the United States, all I could take out of Denmark, I could get $100. That's all they allowed me to buy, because dollars were very scarce in Europe, way, way up in the 50s.
Yeah.
And even in 55, there was still rationing in England. And of course, England was completely wiped out economically. Had it not been for the United States, it would have taken many, many more years for Europe to come back together. Most of the German population, they favored Hitler as long as things went well. But then after the war, you could hardly find a German that had been for Hitler.
Yeah.
And they say, oh, we didn't know anything about killing 5 million Jews. We didn't know anything about that. Well, I'm sure that many people didn't really know, but they were suspicious, or they could figure out what had happened, because already in 1938 and 39, bandits, Nazis, would smash the windows of Jewish shops, steal their apartment, steal their money, and beat them up. And
Crystal night.
But you see, there's always been, for many years, several hundred years, Jews were not well liked in many countries in Europe. And there was a hatred against them for one reason or another. I didn't know anything about Jews. I knew there were a people called Jews, but in Denmark there were only about 5,000. One of my classmates was a Jew. But many people in Europe, particularly the Austrians, they were very hateful, and the Germans too. Why, I don't really know. Well, the Jews were accused, at least by Hitler, as controlling the money in the world. And of course, that's not true. There are some banking houses that are run, or were run, by Jews, but so what? It has to be run by somebody. You see, in the Middle Ages, and even up until 150, 200 years ago, it was under their pride for Christians to have anything to do with money. You could not take interest because that was a sin.
Yeah.
And it was called usury. And you would lose your soul, or your soul wouldn't go to heaven or whatever. But then they thought, well, why not let the Jews take care of the money?
Yeah.
Because according to Christians, the Jews didn't have a soul to worry about. So, of course, the Jews became very good at banking. See, so many things are overshadowed by my experiences in the war, that everything was sort of pushed aside because that became the dominant factor. When you see people get shot in the streets just at random, I mean, that makes an impression on you.